I am Dana Whitford, 34, an urban planner in Denver. And on the night my family gathered for their grand Christmas dinner, I walked through the door holding a tray of rosemary biscuits I baked before leaving work. Celeste barely glanced at me as she shifted a cluster of gold ornaments and said, "Donna, tonight is for Brianna's guests, so please don't complicate the atmosphere." I stood there long enough to see that the chair where I had always sat had vanished, replaced by a narrow side table pushed against a rack of damp wool coats. The heat in the room felt staged, but the message underneath it was unmistakably cold. Brianna lifted her glass the moment she noticed me lingering near the threshold and said, "You can set your tray over there. Dana, we're already at capacity." Her smile carried the same polite finality as a closed door, and several relatives offered the kind of nod reserved for acquaintances at airport lounges. I kept my voice steady as I placed the biscuits on the table and said, "I didn't realize 48 seats still couldn't stretch one more." Celeste corrected me without missing a beat, claiming that some arrangements were too delicate to adjust. Raymond continued carving roast tenderloin as though my presence required no acknowledgement, and the hum around the long dining table rose with a careful brightness that excluded me entirely. Brianna leaned back in her chair and said, "Some gatherings work better when everyone knows their role." And a few cousins laughed in quiet agreement. I sat at the side table, listening to the clinking silverware, aware that even the children's place settings had more ceremony than mine. My pulse steadied as I reached into my coat pocket and brushed the sealed black envelope I had carried from Chicago since morning. The hall smelled faintly of pine sap and overripe berries from the wreaths, and every detail of the room settled into place like a scene built to reinforce hierarchy. Celeste announced the start of the meal with a raised chin, and Brianna tapped her glass with a flourish that belonged to someone certain of her audience. I watched them glide through their performance while my fingertips traced the edges of the envelope against the lining of my coat. Its weight grounded me more than the stool I sat on, because I already knew that nothing in that room could hold its shape once the seal was broken. Brianna shifted in her chair as the servers refilled glasses, and she said, "Before we get too far into dinner, I should share the good news about the hotel expansion endowment they finalized for me last week." Her voice carried easily over the table, and several relatives murmured approval as though her accomplishment belonged to them. Celeste brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and added, "She's earned every bit of it," directing the faintest smile toward me as if to underline the contrast. I sat at the side table, hearing the polished certainty in their tone settle over the room like a closed door. Raymond finally looked up long enough to say, "Brianna understands how to position herself for opportunities." And his knife scraped lightly against the plate as he resumed cutting his tenderloin. Brianna lifted her glass toward him and replied, "Some of us just know how to read the room," letting her gaze drift past me without stopping. A cluster of cousins echoed her toast with the warmth reserved for a rising favorite, and their laughter threaded around me with the easy rhythm of a conversation that never required my presence. I kept my posture still, feeling the hum of approval wrap them together with practiced ease. A server reached past me to set a carafe of cider on the counter, barely glancing in my direction before returning to the main table where the others waited with lifted hands. Celeste tilted her head toward him and said, "Be careful with that near her. She's always been a bit clumsy around gatherings." And a ripple of polite amusement moved from one end of the table to the other. Brianna leaned toward her fiancé and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "This is why some events need boundaries." And his quiet chuckle joined the running thread of well-contained ridicule. I folded my hands together to steady the tension rising against my ribs, while the clatter of shared celebration continued without pause. As the conversation turned toward vacation plans and investment updates, someone asked Brianna how soon she would be traveling to Florida to oversee the hotel's press rollout. She answered, "Right after New Year's. Unless Mom wants me here for another dinner." And Celeste replied, "Only if Dana doesn't complicate things," which earned another round of knowing smiles. Raymond dabbed the corner of his mouth and said, "Let's just keep the peace tonight." Though his eyes never shifted toward me, I let their words settle as naturally as the faint draft drifting from the coat rack. Because the envelope in my pocket remained the only thing in the room that had been waiting for me. When the chatter swelled again around the main table, I rose from the narrow stool and walked toward Raymond with the black envelope in my hand. And the room thinned into a single line of silence as I set it beside his plate. He glanced at it as though it had landed there by mistake. So I said, "Open it." "Raymond," because it was addressed to you long before tonight. And Brianna shifted in her chair, as if the sound of her name might follow. Celeste reached for my arm and muttered, "Dana, stop creating scenes." Yet her fingers tightened when I pulled away. I met Raymond's eyes and added, "You've ignored me all evening. Don't ignore this." He broke the seal with a small tear and unfolded the first document. And the few relatives close enough to see the heading stiffened before anyone else grasped what he held. His jaw tightened as he whispered, "This can't be right." But I said, "It's a certified DNA test from Chicago. And you already know what it says." Celeste tried to grab the page and snapped, "She must have forged something. This is ridiculous." Though her voice fractured at the center, Brianna leaned forward and demanded, "Why would you bring something like that here?" But the answer hovered plainly between us as Raymond stared at the result he had feared for decades. The test lay on the linen in full view now. And I said, "You can repeat it 100 times, and it will still read 0%. While Celeste's breath caught in a visible break across her composure, Raymond whispered, "You should have come to me before doing this." But his tone carried the strain of someone losing a defense he thought would last longer. Brianna looked from me to him and said, "What is she talking about?" And the silence that followed exposed their hierarchy more clearly than any seating chart. I steadied my voice and said, "I didn't come here to ask questions. I came with answers." Raymond reached into the envelope again and unfolded the letter written in Martin Keating's narrow script. And the paper trembled slightly as he scanned the opening lines. Celeste muttered, "Not him. Not this." As though the name alone reopened a door she had locked in her mind. But I said, "He was my biological father. And he wrote that knowing you would try to bury it." Brianna pushed back in her chair and said, "You can't just claim someone like that." Yet the letter's signature sat beneath her denial in unshakable ink. Raymond swallowed hard as he read Martin's explanation that his estate included a share reserved for the daughter he had never been allowed to acknowledge. I watched their reactions shift as the words settled. And I said, "He left instructions for this letter to be delivered 6 months after his death. Because he knew the truth wouldn't survive this house while he was alive." Celeste pressed her napkin to her mouth and whispered, "I did what I had to," though the tremor in her voice betrayed the weight she had carried. Raymond finally looked at me and said, "You don't understand what that man threatened." But the excuses dissolved under the clarity of Martin's handwriting. I kept my footing evenly and said, "What he offered wasn't a threat. And you both knew it the moment you hid his letter." Raymond kept the letter open in his hands. And before anyone could speak again, I took the final document from the envelope and said, "You should finish what you started. Because this is the part you never planned to explain." He stared at the heading as though the print might rearrange itself. And he muttered, "This is a private agreement that has nothing to do with you." But the tremor in his voice undercut every word. Brianna rose halfway from her chair and said, "Dad, tell her she misunderstood." Though her confidence slipped when he didn't answer. I laid the document beside his plate and said, "It's a share transfer recorded in Illinois. And you signed it as if you were the trustee of something that wasn't yours." Celeste reached toward the page with a quick motion and whispered, "You don't know what you're looking at." But I kept my hand steady as I replied, "I know exactly what it is." Because Martin's attorney explained every line. Raymond pushed the letter aside and said, That man abandoned his responsibilities long before any of this. And I stepped in to protect what little order this family had left. Though the flush on his neck showed the strain of maintaining that story. Brianna's eyes shifted sharply toward him as she said, "What does this have to do with my endowment?" And the edge in her tone broke through her earlier poise. I answered her evenly, saying, "Everything you celebrated tonight was funded by dividends from shares meant for me." Celeste shook her head and said, "Your imagination is running wild. Dana, you're twisting documents you barely understand." But her voice cracked as she glanced at the notarized signature. Raymond leaned forward with his palms flattened against the table and muttered, "Families make compromises when the truth threatens to destroy them," as though the explanation might disguise the admission beneath it. Brianna's jaw tightened when she looked at the line item detailing 10 years of payments. And she said, "So the money Mom said you saved for me didn't come from your company at all." I kept my eyes on Raymond as I said, "He redirected dividends into 2 shell LLCs and used them to build a narrative that made you feel chosen." The room had lost its earlier warmth, and Raymond exhaled sharply as he said, "I handled the trust because someone had to. And no court would have given it to a child fathered in an affair." Celeste whispered, "Stop talking." But he waved her off with a strained gesture that revealed more than his words. Brianna pressed her fingers against her temple and said, "Tell me you didn't risk everything over a trust you weren't entitled to manage." Though she already understood the answer, I let the silence settle before saying, "He managed it the way he managed me, quietly, illegally, and with the expectation that I'd never question him." Raymond finally closed the document, unable to meet my eyes, and said, "You weren't supposed to find any of this." With the resignation of someone who had run out of exits, Celeste clutched the edge of the table and murmured, "We did what we had to for this family." But the justification rang hollow against the weight of their choices. Brianna looked between them with a dawning realization that her stability had been built on a fault line she never saw coming. I stood anchored in the same spot and said, "Martin left those shares so his daughter wouldn't be erased. And you spent a decade proving exactly why he was right." At the New Year's charity gala in Chicago, I stepped into the backstage corridor just as Brianna fastened the clasp of her gown and told her assistant, "This speech will seal my place with the investors." And her certainty filled the narrow space like a script she had memorized. She turned when she heard me say her name. And I added, "You're about to speak on family legacy, so we should be honest about what built it," which made her posture sharpen as if the angle alone might hold her ground. Celeste appeared behind her and whispered, "Dana, not here." But the strain in her voice revealed she already knew why I had come. Raymond approached with a measured breath and muttered, "You should leave before this becomes something it doesn't need to be." Though his eyes flicked toward the folder in my hand, I held the folder at my side and said, "This isn't becoming anything. It already is." While Brianna stepped closer and replied, "You can't drag your drama into a room full of donors." I met her skepticism with, "I'm not dragging anything. I'm returning what your father took." And the color shifted beneath her confidence as she glanced toward Raymond. Celeste reached for her clutch as if it might anchor her, murmuring, "We can discuss this quietly." But the rustle of the ballroom beyond the curtain made her words feel too late for discretion. Raymond straightened his jacket and said, "Dana, don't make a spectacle." Though the tremor in his tone betrayed a deeper worry. A stage manager passed us and announced that Brianna would be introduced in 3 minutes. And she forced a smile as she said, "I have responsibilities tonight. So whatever you think you uncovered won't matter after this event." I opened the folder and replied, "It mattered enough for a judge to review it yesterday." And Raymond's breath caught with a sharpness that cut through the background music. Celeste whispered, "You filed something without speaking to us as if the question itself could delay what followed." Brianna shook her head and said, You don't have the authority to challenge a trust that isn't yours. But her conviction thinned when she saw the stamped order. Logan Briggs stepped into the corridor, carrying a sealed stack of documents. And he said, "I'm here for Raymond Whitford and Celeste Whitford." While the stage lights dimmed in preparation for Brianna's entrance. Raymond whispered, "Not tonight." But Logan replied, "These orders require immediate service," and placed the packet in his hands. Celeste took a half step back when Logan handed her the second envelope. And she said, "There must be some mistake." Yet the embossed seal left no room for uncertainty. I remained steady and said, "The court approved asset freezes pending review of the trust mismanagement." Brianna's assistant called her name from the curtain, but she didn't move. And she stared at her parents as she said, "What did you do with a disbelief that pressed the air between us?" Raymond tried to speak, but only managed. "We were protecting the family." And Celeste added, "This didn't have to happen." Though neither explanation reached beyond their guilt. I looked at Brianna and said, "You plan to talk about legacy tonight. But the legacy you're standing on isn't yours." And her silence answered more than her words could. The murmur from the ballroom swelled as the host repeated her name once more. And the weight of the moment settled across all three of them. I closed the folder and said, "Chicago deserved the truth before hearing you speak." And Raymond lowered his head as though the gesture alone might shield him from the fallout. Celeste clutched the order against her chest and whispered, "You've ruined everything." But the strain in her voice made clear she understood who had set this ending in motion. Brianna looked toward the stage where her introduction faded into confusion. And she said, "This will follow us forever." Though she didn't dispute a single detail, I stepped back toward the exit and said, "It should follow the people who created it," leaving them anchored in a silence shaped entirely by their choices. When I left the gala and returned to Denver, the cold around the apartment door felt steadier than the noise I'd walked away from in Chicago. And I set my phone on the counter just as a new message appeared from Sharon Doyle. She wrote, "The court has acknowledged your standing in Martin's estate, and the preliminary ruling confirms your right to the 18% share." And the clarity in her words settled the last thread of doubt I'd carried since the envelope first opened. I called her back and said, "Thank you for pushing this through before the holiday." And she replied, "It was overdue. Dana. And no one can redirect a cent of it now." I ended the call with a quiet breath, letting the finality of her statement mark the first still moment I'd had in weeks. The next morning, I drafted the founding outline for the Keating Urban Fellowship. And as I typed the initial mission statement, I said aloud, "This fund will support students whose families limit their opportunities." Because naming the purpose made the work feel real. Sharon called again to confirm the transfer timeline and said, "Once the assets clear review, you can move forward with public filings." And I answered, "I'll be ready for that as soon as the court signs off." She paused before adding, "He tried to hide your future from you." And I replied, "It's mine now, and I intend to use it." The conversation ended with a shared sense of completion rather than celebration. By late afternoon, I walked through the planning office where I'd worked before stepping away to care for Celeste. And I greeted a colleague who asked how long I planned to stay in Denver. I told her, "Long enough to rebuild what I set aside." And she nodded with the kind of understanding that didn't need further detail. Another coworker said, "We always hoped you'd come back." And I answered, "I'm coming back on my own terms this time." The familiarity of their voices reminded me that not every connection had been shaped by obligation. That evening, I opened the balcony door and let the city settle into its quiet rhythm while I reviewed the fellowship draft one more time. And the stillness around me felt earned rather than borrowed. I said softly, "This is the first thing I've built for myself." And the words didn't shake the way I expected them to. When Sharon sent a final confirmation that the paperwork would be filed in the morning, I replied. Then tomorrow is a new beginning. I closed my laptop with the steady sense that nothing about my life needed to fit the shape it once held. Thank you for staying with me through every turn of this story. Because sharing it reminds me that beginnings can rise from the quietest places. If my journey offered you even a moment of strength, I'm grateful you were here to hear it. I hope you'll stay for the next chapter I tell. And if you do, I invite you to subscribe so we can keep finding these moments together.